Every shadow hides a secret. Every silence tells a story. Some mysteries were never meant to be uncovered, but tonight, you're about to witness one. Welcome to Taka Tales. There are thousands of hiking trails hidden inside America's national parks, and most of them are perfectly safe. But every so often, a trail is closed without any explanation. No warning about wildlife, no notice of dangerous terrain, and no record of why it was abandoned. Most hikers see the sign and turn around. 5 friends ignored it, believing it was nothing more than a forgotten path leading to an old ranger station. Only one of them ever made it back. Years later, he still hears footsteps following him every single night. And sometimes, there are more footsteps than there should be. It happened during the final weekend of September, when the summer heat had finally begun to fade, and the crisp mountain air carried the first unmistakable signs of autumn. The days were still warm enough for hiking, but the nights had become cold, filling the forest with a quiet stillness that made the stars seem brighter than ever. My friend Jason had organized a camping trip deep inside one of America's oldest national parks, convinced we all needed a break from the noise, traffic, and endless stress of city life. At the time, it sounded like the perfect escape. Jason was the adventurous one in our group. He had an obsession with abandoned places, forgotten roads, and mysterious locations that most people avoided. To him, warning signs were never meant to stop anyone. They were invitations to discover what everyone else had missed. If he found a locked gate, he wanted to know what was behind it. If a building had been abandoned for years, he couldn't resist exploring it. Emma joined because photography was her passion. She carried an expensive professional camera everywhere she went and had an incredible eye for capturing beauty in places most people ignored. Chris, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of Jason. A former soldier with years of survival training, he planned for every possible emergency. His backpack was filled with enough food, medical supplies, navigation tools, and survival gear to keep all 5 of us alive for an entire week if something went wrong. Natalie had never gone camping before. She admitted she was nervous about spending nights in the wilderness, but Jason promised the trip would be peaceful and unforgettable. As for me, my name is Daniel. I wasn't searching for adventure or mystery. I simply needed a few quiet days away from work, my phone, and the exhausting routine of everyday life. That first evening was everything we had hoped for. We pitched our tents beneath towering pine trees, cooked dinner over a crackling campfire, laughed late into the night, and shared stories beneath a sky filled with countless stars. Surrounded by the peaceful silence of the forest, none of us had the slightest idea that our lives were about to change forever. We believed we were beginning an ordinary camping trip. In reality, we had already taken the first step toward a nightmare that only one of us would survive. The next morning, after breakfast, Jason pulled an old paper map from his backpack that he had bought from an online collector before the trip. Unlike the official park maps, this one had been printed more than 30 years earlier and showed several hiking trails that had long since disappeared from modern records. One trail in particular immediately captured Jason's attention. It was labeled Alder Ridge Trail, a narrow path that stretched deep into the forest, before ending at what appeared to be an old ranger station or fire lookout. Jason became convinced there was something fascinating waiting at the end of it. Chris immediately disagreed, reminding us that trails usually disappear from maps because they become dangerous or unsafe. He insisted we stay on the marked routes and avoid unnecessary risks. Jason laughed and said that was exactly why the forgotten trail was worth exploring. His excitement eventually convinced the rest of us to at least take a look. After hiking nearly 2 miles through the forest, we found the hidden entrance almost completely covered by thick bushes and overgrown branches. A rusted chain stretched across the path between 2 weathered wooden posts. Hanging from it was a faded wooden sign with only 2 words carved into it: "Trail closed." There was no explanation, no warning symbol, no date, and no clue why anyone had sealed the trail away. Despite Chris's repeated warnings, curiosity eventually got the better of all of us. One by one, we stepped over the rusted chain and entered the forgotten trail, convinced we would explore for a few minutes before turning back. At first, the forest felt completely normal. Sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, birds flew from branch to branch, insects buzzed in the warm air, and a cool breeze gently rustled the leaves above us. It almost seemed ridiculous that anyone would close such a peaceful trail. But about 15 minutes into the hike, everything changed without warning. The birds stopped singing. The insects fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to disappear, leaving the trees perfectly still. The only sound left was our own footsteps echoing unnaturally through the forest. The silence felt heavy, almost as if the entire forest was listening to us. Natalie nervously whispered that something didn't feel right. And for the first time, even Jason stopped joking. Chris pulled out his compass to reassure himself, and although the needle still pointed north, he looked more uneasy than before. We continued deeper into the woods until the trees suddenly opened into a perfectly circular clearing. Standing alone in the center was an abandoned wooden ranger station, untouched by time, silent, and somehow waiting as though it had expected us all along. Jason eagerly stepped onto the rotting porch while Chris reluctantly followed, reminding everyone not to touch anything unnecessary. Inside, the abandoned ranger station smelled of damp wood, rust, and years of neglect. Dust covered the broken furniture, and sunlight slipped through cracked windows onto an old wooden desk. Curious, I opened one of its drawers and discovered a mold-covered notebook that somehow still held readable pages. The journal belonged to Ranger Thomas Bell, who had worked there decades earlier. His first entries described routine patrols, changing weather, and wildlife sightings. But the later pages became increasingly frantic. He wrote about hearing footsteps outside the station every night without finding tracks by morning. Families reporting voices calling from the forest, disappearing trail markers, and search parties walking in circles. One final entry mentioned 6 sets of footprints following only 5 hikers. Before anyone spoke, a floorboard suddenly creaked somewhere behind us. The unexpected noise instantly silenced everyone. Chris slowly opened the back room, expecting to find an animal or another person hiding inside. But the small room was completely empty, except for an old cot and deep, claw-like scratches covering one wall. Emma photographed everything, while Jason nervously laughed, trying to convince himself it was nothing. We decided to leave immediately, but the moment we stepped outside, the clearing no longer looked the same. The single trail we had used to enter had disappeared, replaced by 3 unfamiliar paths leading into the trees. Chris pulled out his compass, only to watch the needle spin endlessly without settling. Jason checked his phone, but the GPS claimed we were miles outside the national park. Following our own footprints only led us back to the same clearing again, proving the forest itself had somehow trapped us inside. Determined to find a way out, Chris took charge of the group and began carving large X marks into nearby trees every few minutes with his survival knife. His plan was simple. If we were walking in circles, the marks would eventually reveal it. For nearly half an hour, we followed what looked like a straight path through the forest, carefully watching every landmark around us. Then Chris suddenly stopped. We had reached the same tree again. But something was wrong. Instead of the single X he had carved earlier, there were now two perfectly identical X marks, one directly above the other. Chris stared at the trunk in disbelief, insisting he had only made one mark. Before anyone could make sense of it, a branch snapped somewhere behind us. Seconds later, another snapped to our left, followed by another farther ahead, as though something invisible was slowly circling us from every direction. Emma nervously lifted her camera and began taking photographs between the trees. In the bright flash of one photo, Natalie froze and whispered that someone was standing in the distance. A tall, pale figure watched us without moving. Then Chris looked down at the muddy ground. His face turned completely white. There were 6 distinct sets of footprints following us, even though only 5 terrified hikers remained together. Panic spread through the group the moment the tall, pale figure silently stepped behind a tree and vanished from sight. Before we could even process what we had seen, 2 more identical figures appeared in different directions, surrounding us without making a single sound. None of them moved. They simply watched us from the darkness between the trees. Fear completely took over, and we ran without choosing a direction, crashing through thick branches, slipping over roots, and pushing through dense undergrowth until our lungs burned, and we could no longer keep running. We finally stopped to catch our breath, but the forest remained unnaturally silent. Then a familiar voice drifted through the trees. It softly called Natalie's name using Jason's exact voice, even though Jason was standing only a few feet away. A second later, the same voice came from another direction, followed by another whisper behind us. Chris immediately warned everyone never to answer unless they could actually see who was speaking. He believed whatever was hunting us had learned how to imitate our voices. As darkness fell much faster than it should have, we decided the ranger station was our only chance of surviving the night. But when we reached the clearing, the station had vanished completely. Only a rectangle of dead grass remained. Then, as if responding to our presence, the abandoned building slowly emerged from the darkness once again. With no other place to hide, we cautiously stepped back inside the ranger station. The moment we crossed the doorway, every one of us froze. The building no longer looked abandoned. The broken furniture had been replaced with clean wooden chairs and a polished desk. A lantern cast a warm, golden glow across the room, and a fresh cup of coffee sat on the table, still steaming as though someone had stepped outside only seconds earlier. It felt as if time inside the station had reversed. Thomas Bell's notebook rested open on the desk, but now several new pages had appeared. The entries warned that the trail never led to a destination. It chose where people would go. It learned voices before copying faces, and once it knew both, escape became almost impossible. One final warning stood out above all the others. Counter your group carefully. If you hear more footsteps than people, never acknowledge the extra one. Before anyone could react, the lantern suddenly went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Dozens of hands slammed violently against the windows, followed by silent faces pressing against the glass. Among them stood Emma, staring at us in terror. She slowly raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the doorway, where a tall, faceless figure now stood perfectly still, silently waiting for someone to notice it. The faceless creature remained perfectly still for only a moment before Chris charged straight toward it, gripping his survival knife with both hands. He shouted for us to run as he swung at the towering figure. Before anyone could reach him, the creature wrapped its impossibly long arms around Chris, and both of them vanished into the darkness beyond the doorway as though they had never existed. A chilling silence followed. Then Chris's voice echoed from deep within the forest, crying out for help and begging us to come find him. Every instinct told us to run toward him, but Thomas Bell's warning echoed in our minds. We forced ourselves to ignore every familiar voice calling our names from the trees. Minutes later, Jason suddenly stopped walking. He stared into the darkness with tears in his eyes. He whispered that he could hear his younger brother, who had died years before, calling for him. Despite our desperate attempts to hold him back, Jason pulled free and disappeared between the trees. His flashlight faded into the darkness before a horrifying scream shattered the silence. Seconds later, Jason's voice calmly called back, insisting he had found the way out. Only Natalie and I remained. Exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified, we eventually stumbled upon the rusted chain blocking the trail entrance, believing our nightmare had finally come to an end. Standing beyond the rusted chain were Emma, Chris, and Jason. They looked exactly as I remembered them, exhausted, frightened, and desperate to escape. They begged us not to leave them behind, insisting they had finally found the way out. For one brief moment, I almost believed them. Then all three smiled at the exact same time, their mouths stretched impossibly wide, far beyond what any human face should allow. In that instant, I realized they were not my friends. They were perfect copies created by whatever haunted Alder Ridge Trail. I grabbed Natalie's hand and told her not to look at their faces as we sprinted toward the chain. The forest exploded with horrifying screams as countless voices called our names. Long, pale fingers reached toward us from the darkness. I managed to leap over the chain, but Natalie stumbled when something grabbed her backpack from behind. I pulled with every ounce of strength I had, until her terrified expression slowly transformed into the same unnatural smile worn by the others. Knowing she was already lost, I let go. I escaped alone. Years later, Emma's camera arrived at my apartment with photographs taken only the night before. The final image showed the ranger station beside a freshly painted wooden sign. It no longer read "Trail Closed." It now read "Trail Open." Since that day, every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., I hear 6 sets of footsteps outside my apartment, and one of them sounds exactly like my own. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and not every warning sign explains the danger waiting beyond it. If you ever find a forgotten trail blocked by an old chain with no explanation, turn around and never look back. And if you ever hear more footsteps than the people walking beside you, whatever you do, don't stop to count them.